The mountain air along the Swiss frontier was thin with the chill of defeat. On April 27, 1945, a figure huddled in the back of a German truck lost inside an oversized military greatcoat and helmet. Only hours before, he had been the dictator of Italy, a man whose voice thundered across the piazzas of Rome. Now he was a fugitive, his destination a desperate, uncertain escape. The loyalty of millions had once been his to command. Yet here he was, hoping to slip unnoticed past his own countrymen. The grand theatrical exit he had always envisioned was dissolving into a grim flight for survival. His fate now rested not in the hands of armies, but in the suspicious eyes of local partisans. The events that would unfold over the next 24 hours were to be the final brutal act of a 2-decade reign. It would be an end stripped of ceremony, played out not in a palace, but in a dusty village square. And in these last moments, the world's memory of Il Duce would be forged forever. The chill of an April morning clung to the shores of Lake Como, a cold mirror to the fear that gripped its passengers. On the 27th day of the month, in the year 1945, a German military convoy rumbled through the town of Como. Buried within it was Benito Mussolini, the once unassailable dictator now reduced to a desperate fugitive. With Allied forces surging from the south and Milan already lost, the winding road toward neutral Switzerland represented his final fleeting hope for survival. The collapse had been breathtakingly swift. Only weeks before, from his headquarters at Garniano, he had projected an air of defiance, clinging to the fiction that his Italian social republic could withstand the tide. But that puppet state, forged in the aftermath of his rescue by German paratroopers, was now disintegrating. The Gothic line had been shattered, German armies were in full retreat, and the countryside seethed with partisan fighters. The convoy itself was a portrait of a fallen regime. High-ranking SS officers shared transport with loyal Italian ministers, their wives clutching jewels and documents, the last vestiges of their wealth. Confused children peered from the windows, sensing the quiet panic of the adults around them. This was not a strategic retreat. It was a frantic, disorganized flight. Mussolini himself had shed his iconic uniform, trading it for a German greatcoat and steel helmet in a desperate gamble to pass unnoticed through the partisan checkpoints that now strangled the escape routes. The transformation was a profound humiliation. The man who had meticulously crafted the image of Il Duce, who had postured for the world in uniforms of his own design, was now hiding his face beneath the insignia of a foreign power. The architect of a new Roman Empire was now just a shadow, hunched in the back of a truck. Traveling separately among the refugees was his mistress, Clara Petacci. She had refused every chance to escape on her own, binding her fate to the man she had loved for more than a decade. Their chosen path hugged the western shore of Lake Como, a route now choked with the defeated and the displaced. The ancient lakeside towns, silent witnesses to centuries of history, were about to watch the final violent act of Italy's fascist dream unfold. A low rumble echoed through the Alpine valleys, the sound of engines straining toward a border that no longer offered salvation. As the convoy snaked through the mountains near Lake Como, each passing hour tightened the knot of dread. Whispers filtered through the column of partisan roadblocks ahead, while rumors confirmed their worst fears. The Swiss were turning people away. The neutral nation, overwhelmed by the flood of fleeing fascists and German officials, had sealed its frontier. For a man like Mussolini, there would be no sanctuary. The partisans' promise, carried on radio waves and scattered leaflets, was one of immediate and merciless justice. For those who had collaborated, for those who had ruled with an iron fist, there would be no trials and no negotiations. Only a final brutal accounting on a roadside. This stark reality settled heavily upon the German officers tasked with Mussolini's protection. Their loyalty to the fallen Duce had evaporated with the Reich's fortunes. He was now a liability, a bargaining chip they might be forced to discard. With Hitler cornered in his Berlin bunker, survival had become their only ideology, and their primary obligation was now to themselves. Colonel Hans Vollmeyer, commanding the escort, had already made his cold calculation. If forced to choose between his own soldiers and the Italian refugees, the latter would be sacrificed without a second thought. In the final, desperate weeks of the war, alliances forged in power dissolved into self-interest, but the time for such desperate bargains was already gone. By midday on the 27th of April, the convoy ground to a halt before its first true obstacle, a partisan checkpoint near the village of Musso. The sudden silence was heavy with unspoken fear as armed figures emerged, their eyes scanning each vehicle with a piercing, predatory focus. These were not soldiers of a formal army, but local men and women who knew the terrain, the faces, and the lies. Acting on intelligence that a high-value target was near, they had been briefed to inspect every truck and to question every claim of military status. In their determined gaze, the final irreversible sequence of events had already begun. On the cold mountain road to Musso, a line had been drawn in the dust, guarded by men who had nothing left to lose. The checkpoint was held by the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, a communist resistance unit named for the 19th century hero of Italian unification. They were not professional soldiers, but farmers, students, and factory workers, their faces etched with the hardships of a nation torn apart. They saw themselves as heirs to Garibaldi's legacy, fighting not for a king, but for the very soul of Italy. Many had lost family to fascist violence or suffered in Mussolini's prisons, and each carried a private war inside them. When the German convoy rumbled into view, the partisans initially prepared to let it pass, their hunt aimed at Italian collaborators, not the retreating Wehrmacht. But something felt wrong, a dissonance that the mountain fighters had learned to trust. One of their leaders, Urbano Lazzaro, felt his suspicions sharpen. He noticed the small, unsettling details, the nervous glances, the ill-fitting greatcoats on men sweating in the cool air. Whispers had arrived over the radio just hours before, warnings of high-value targets cloaked in German uniforms, and Lazzaro's military eye saw the cracks in the convoy's facade. He gave the order that would alter Italian history, a thorough inspection. His men moved with a tense purpose, their weapons low but ready, their questions cutting through the alpine quiet in German and Italian. The genuine German officers were composed, their papers in order, their authority practiced and efficient. They understood their survival depended on the fragile illusion of a routine military evacuation, but they were powerless to help the passengers they were hiding. Under the partisans' hardening gaze, the charade crumbled. A flash of forbidden color, an Italian military pin beneath a German collar. A voice that stumbled over basic German, its accent an immediate betrayal. Then, as one man was asked for his papers, his hands trembled so violently that the documents scattered to the ground, revealing Italian identity cards mixed among the forged credentials. The entire deception lay exposed on the dusty road. The air at the checkpoint was thin and cold, each breath a cloud of white vapor. Amidst the German military credentials, a handful of Italian identity cards surfaced, deepening the partisan suspicion. The most damning discovery came as one fighter's eyes locked onto a minor fascist official, a man known for his brutal reprisals against local civilians. He had swathed a distinctive facial scar in bandages, feigning a war wound, but his voice and his cold eyes were seared into the memory of those who had survived his cruelty. It was in this atmosphere of rising tension that another partisan saw a face he knew not from a crime, but from 2 decades of propaganda. Despite the ill-fitting German helmet and a posture hunched in defeat, the jutting jaw and piercing eyes were unmistakable. A hushed, urgent whisper spread through the ranks, an electric current of disbelief and triumph. It was a young fighter named Giuseppe Negri, who had grown up with that face staring down from every classroom wall, who first gave voice to the impossible thought, identifying Il Duce and sending a shockwave through the checkpoint. Realizing his disguise was compromised, Mussolini made a final, desperate gambit. He straightened his shoulders, attempting to summon the commanding presence that had once mesmerized crowds from palace balconies and held the attention of world leaders. For a fleeting second, he tried to project the authority that had bent a nation to his will. But the context had changed, the power had evaporated, and the same gestures that once inspired awe now appeared only pathetic. The partisans saw not a titan, but a frightened old man in a shabby coat, grasping at an authority that had long since crumbled to dust. The capture was immediate and decisive. Partisans swarmed the vehicle, their weapons trained on the occupants, who were suddenly the most valuable prisoners in northern Italy. As the Germans were separated from the Italians, the convoy's true purpose became brutally clear. This was no military retreat, but a desperate escape by the most wanted men in the country. Colonel Fallmeyer, the German officer in charge, instantly distanced himself from his passengers, insisting his unit had only offered transport as a humanitarian gesture. His swift abandonment of his former allies was a stark symbol of the Axis's final, bitter collapse. During a thorough search of the entire convoy, Clara Petacci was discovered in another vehicle and detained. Her presence confirmed what the partisans had suspected. They had captured not just a fleeing fascist, but the dictator himself, along with the woman who had shared his final years. The identification of Petacci added another layer of meaning to the capture. She was a public figure, held up by fascist media as an ideal, even as her true relationship with Mussolini was carefully hidden. Her decision to stay with him in his final flight was an act of personal loyalty that would ultimately cost her everything. Like wildfire across dry grass, the news of the capture ignited the partisan network. Within hours, coded messages crackled over radios, and runners carried the word through mountain passes to isolated units who had fought for months without hope of such a victory. Leaders throughout northern Italy knew that Il Duce was finally in their hands. The psychological impact far outweighed the immediate military gain. For fighters who had endured years of loss and sacrifice, seizing the man who had seemed almost superhuman was the ultimate validation of their struggle. This momentous victory, however, presented an immediate and dangerous problem. The partisans now possessed the single most wanted man in Italy, and they had to decide his fate in a landscape of shifting allegiances and advancing armies. As darkness fell on the 27th of April, Mussolini was brought to a small, cramped farmhouse in the village of Bonzanigo. The man who had commanded from marble halls now found himself a prisoner, waiting in the gloom of a modest stone room. The walls of his prison were not of iron, but of simple, rough-hewn stone. This modest peasant dwelling, cramped and crudely furnished, was a universe removed from the grand palaces and sprawling residences he had once commanded. The Villa Torlonia in Rome, his home as prime minister, now seemed a distant gilded dream. The partisans had selected this farmhouse with care, a remote outpost hidden from lingering fascist sympathizers and German patrols, yet tethered to their command for the swift passage of information. The family who owned this land had suffered under his regime, their loyalty to the cause forged in hardship, making them the perfect guardians for Italy's most infamous prisoner. Here, the man who had once dictated the fate of millions would endure the most powerless night of his life. He was confined to a small room with Clara Petacci, watched over by armed men who saw not a former head of state, but a war criminal accountable for immeasurable suffering. Their loaded weapons and unwavering gaze never left him as they rotated their watch through the long, dark hours. Throughout that night, a profound psychological transformation took hold. The man who had dominated European politics for over 20 years, who had stood as an equal with Hitler and inspired the devotion of a nation, now paced the floor like a caged animal. His behavior swung between desperate grasps at dignity and moments of pure, visible terror. His destiny was now entirely in the hands of the farmers and factory workers he had once dismissed as insignificant. He tried to reason with his captors, his voice a strained echo of its former power. At times, he appealed to their shared Italian nationalism, reminding them of territorial gains and modernized infrastructure. At others, he tried to bargain for his life, offering hidden fascist gold and the locations of other fleeing officials in exchange for his safety. But his words found no purchase. The partisans remained unmoved, their faces etched with the memory of war's horrors. Many had lost family in the conflict he had championed. All carried the scars of brutal reprisals and the violent repression that defined his rule. For them, justice was not a matter for negotiation. Clara Petacci's presence added a tragic and complex dimension to the tension. She had been given numerous chances to flee alone, to seek safety for herself, yet she chose to remain with Mussolini, bound to his uncertain fate. Her loyalty was a quiet, heartbreaking act in the face of absolute peril. The partisans debated her future in hushed, urgent tones. Some saw a victim of circumstance, a woman caught in the gears of history. Others insisted her years as the dictator's companion made her complicit, a willing symbol of the very regime they had fought to destroy. While she tried to comfort Mussolini, she wrestled with her own mounting fear. Her life of protected luxury had evaporated, leaving her exposed to the brutal reality that association with power had now made her a target. Meanwhile, urgent communications crackled between partisan commanders across the region. The capture of Mussolini was an event of unprecedented scale, both a monumental opportunity and a catastrophic problem. They had accomplished the impossible. The question now was what to do with him. In the hushed aftermath of the capture, a new and dangerous question arose. They had accomplished the impossible, taking alive the man who had plunged Italy into ruin, but now they faced the stark uncertainty of what to do with him. For some partisan leaders, the path was clear: a public trial. Justice demanded that Mussolini answer for his crimes in a court of law, creating an undeniable historical record and lending legitimacy to their cause. It would prove they were builders of a new Italy, not merely agents of revenge. But for others, the cold logic of a courtroom felt like a suicidal fantasy, a delay that risked everything. The chaotic reality of the front lines demanded a swifter, more final solution. This debate exposed the deep fissures within the resistance itself. Communist elements pushed for immediate revolutionary justice and execution to cauterize the wound and ensure the fascist regime could never return. Meanwhile, liberal and moderate fighters argued for legal process, hoping to lay a democratic foundation for the nation they envisioned. Any delay, however, courted disaster, as remaining fascist loyalists or advancing Allied troops could intervene at any moment. As the long night deepened, fragmented reports began to filter in, each one adding to the crushing weight of the decision. High-ranking fascists were being captured all along the escape route, the entire leadership of the Italian Social Republic falling into their hands. Alessandro Pavolini, the fanatical organizer, was taken near Bergamo. Achille Staras, the party's brutal enforcer, was now a prisoner near Como. Their net had swept up not just the dictator, but his entire government. In his own confinement, the former dictator could feel the hours slipping away. His guards later recalled a mind swinging between defiance and remorse, one moment insisting history would vindicate him, the next lamenting the profound human cost of his war. He spoke often of his children, his concern for their fate in a world that would soon be free of his influence. The name of his daughter, Etta, and her executed husband, Galeazzo Ciano, hung in the air, a testament to the personal toll of his political choices. His thoughts drifted to the disastrous pact with Hitler, a bitter reflection on being treated as a junior partner in an alliance that had sealed his doom. He seemed to grasp in those final hours that this alignment had been the fatal error from which all other calamities had flowed. But as the first pale light of April 28th touched the horizon, such reflections became irrelevant. During the tense night-long deliberations, a decision had been reached. The arguments were over, and the final act of Mussolini's life was about to begin. A cold dawn broke over the mountains on April 28th, carrying with it a sense of grim finality. Throughout the night, partisan commanders had debated in hushed, urgent tones, and by morning, their verdict was absolute. There would be no lengthy trial, no transfer to Allied custody, and no chance for Mussolini to become a rallying point for a shattered fascist cause. The instrument of this swift justice was a man known as Colonel Valerio, a communist commander named Walter Audizio. For him, this was not merely a military necessity, but a deeply personal reckoning for years of resistance and the comrades lost to the regime's brutality. When his small team arrived at the farmhouse in Bonzanigo, the air was thick with unspoken purpose. Upon seeing Audizio, the former dictator seemed to grasp his fate instantly. The partisan commander's words were direct. The National Liberation Committee had condemned him to death for his crimes against the Italian people. The dictator's composure fractured, replaced by a torrent of desperate bargains, offers of hidden gold, secrets of state, and pleas for a life that, just days before, had seemed untouchable. But Audizio was the embodiment of a revolutionary justice that had no room for appeal. Clara Petacci's fate was sealed by her association. Her cries for mercy were futile whispers, lost in the roar of a nation demanding retribution. The prisoners were methodically loaded into a vehicle, their short journey a silent final procession through the winding mountain roads near Lake Como. Mussolini sat cloistered in silence, the 23 years of his iron-fisted rule collapsing into these last fleeting moments. His reign would not end in some grand historical spectacle, but here, in an obscure village few had ever heard of. The vehicle slowed, coming to a stop before the unassuming wall of a villa in the small commune of Giulino di Mezzegra. The air in the quiet residential street was still, heavy with the scent of spring blossoms. It was here, before the ornate gate of a modest estate, that one of the 20th century's most infamous dictatorships would meet its unceremonious end. Just after 4 in the afternoon on the 28th of April, 1945, the vehicle carrying Mussolini and Petacci arrived at Villa Belmonte. The location had been chosen for its privacy, a place where the sharp report of gunfire would not immediately summon a crowd. Walter Audizio ordered the prisoners from the car, positioning them against the villa's iron gate. The scene was disturbingly ordinary, a street of simple homes and tidy gardens, offering no hint that it was about to be seared into modern Italian history. In his final moments, Mussolini struggled for a composure that had long since abandoned him. He tried to stand tall, a phantom of the strongman he once was, but a tremor in his hands and the unmistakable fear in his eyes betrayed the facade. Clara Petacci seemed lost in a fog of disbelief, as if still unable to grasp that her devotion would cost her life. She tried to speak, but Audizio, focused only on his grim task, allowed no time for prolonged farewells. The execution was brutally swift. Audizio raised his weapon and fired a volley of shots at close range, the sound shattering the suburban calm. Both Mussolini and Petacci collapsed instantly. The man who had dominated Italy for over 2 decades was dead in a matter of seconds. There were no grand final words, no dramatic gestures, only the abrupt end of a life that had twisted the destiny of millions. After confirming they were dead, the partisan commander ordered his men to load the bodies into the vehicle for the journey to Milan. They understood a fundamental truth. For the long nightmare to be truly over, the Italian people needed to see with their own eyes that the fascist regime had been vanquished. As the car departed Giulino di Mezzegra, it left behind only scattered belongings and bloodstains that the next rain would wash away. Through the fading light, Audizio and his team navigated treacherous mountain roads, transporting their cargo toward the city. The route was still haunted by scattered German patrols and die-hard fascist loyalists, making every shadow a potential threat. News of the dictator's death was already spreading through partisan networks, a rumor whispered on the wind. But what awaited the bodies in Milan would complete the symbolic destruction of Italian fascism in a way no one could have foreseen. The truck rumbled through the darkness, its grim cargo a silent testament to a fallen world. An inescapable irony hung in the air. These were the same roads the dictator had once traveled in armored motorcades, flanked by cheering crowds, and now his body was being smuggled through the night like contraband. For the partisan commander, Audizio, a critical decision loomed over how to present Mussolini's death. Simply announcing an execution would not be enough to undo the conditioning of an entire nation. After 23 years of carefully orchestrated propaganda, many Italians still viewed Mussolini as something more than a man, a figure whose political instincts bordered on the supernatural. Even as fascist legions crumbled and German support evaporated, a stubborn belief persisted that Il Duce would somehow escape, that he would rise again to fight another day. It would require a visceral, undeniable truth to finally break the spell. As the vehicle neared Milan, fragmented reports confirmed the partisan success across northern Italy. Other high-ranking fascist officials had been captured and executed, the entire leadership of the Italian Social Republic collapsing in a matter of hours. This final, brutal purge was the culmination of a resistance that had cost thousands of partisan lives over months of bitter struggle. A plan was solidified. The bodies would be displayed publicly in Milan's Piazzale Loreto. The location was chosen for its terrible symbolic power. Only months earlier, this same square had been the site of a gruesome fascist warning where the bodies of 15 executed partisans were left on public view. Now, the ground that had been used for intimidation would serve as a stage for liberation's savage climax, with the regime's leaders replacing their victims. As night fell on April 28th, the convoy entered the outskirts of a city in flux where retreating German forces ceded control to the ascendant partisans. The stage was being set for a spectacle of public fury that no one, least of all its organizers, could ever hope to control. As dawn broke over Milan on April 29, 1945, a chilling spectacle was unfolding in Piazzale Loreto. During the dark early hours, the bodies of Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and other high-ranking fascists had been brought to the square. As word spread through the city's winding streets, a tide of humanity began to flow toward the scene. What followed was a cathartic explosion of emotion, the release of over 2 decades of pent-up fear and rage. Those who had lost loved ones to the regime, who had suffered under its violent repression, and who had endured the ruin of war, now had a tangible symbol of their liberation. The crowd was a cross-section of a society scarred by dictatorship, each person drawn by an urgent need to see the proof for themselves. The scene descended into an emotionally charged chaos. People surged forward, desperate for a closer look at the man who had cast such a long shadow over their lives. Some stared in stunned silence, unable to believe the dictator was truly gone, while others spat on the corpses or aimed kicks at the lifeless forms. It was a raw, visceral confirmation that the era of fascism had finally reached its end. Beyond simple vengeance, the public display served a dual purpose. For the partisan movement, it was the undeniable evidence of their victory, a declaration that their primary mission was complete. For ordinary Italians, it offered a profound psychological release, the moment they could see with their own eyes that the man they were taught to revere was merely mortal. The crowd's fury reflected the complex and volatile relationship many had with the fallen leader. Some who now jeered had once cheered his rise to power in the 1920s or supported his imperial ambitions. Faced with the devastating consequences of those choices, their emotions churned into a bitter mixture of shame, relief, and vindictive satisfaction. International journalists captured the scene, their reports describing one of the most dramatic ends to a modern dictatorship. The images transmitted across the globe provided stark visual proof that another of the Axis leaders had met his fate. For Allied forces still fighting elsewhere, the photographs from Piazzale Loreto became powerful propaganda, a sign that total victory was inevitable. As the morning wore on, the crowd swelled, with people traveling from surrounding towns to witness the historic moment. The square was transformed into a pilgrimage site for anyone who had suffered under the regime. But as the day progressed, both Italian authorities and Allied commanders grew concerned, fearing the volatile situation could spiral out of control. By late afternoon, Allied military authorities intervened to end the public exhibition. The bodies were removed from the square and taken for burial in unmarked graves, bringing the grim spectacle to a close. The physical display had ended, but the questions surrounding Mussolini's final hours were only just beginning to surface. Even in death, the dictator cast a long shadow over the ruins of his regime. The manner of his end ignited immediate controversy, with voices rising in a fierce debate across the scarred landscape of Italy. For some, the partisan execution was rough justice, a fitting end for a tyrant who had shown his own victims no mercy. For others, it was a lost opportunity for a formal reckoning in a courtroom where the full accounting of fascist crimes could be laid bare for history. But the maelstrom of the war's final days allowed for no such deliberation. Events unfolded with breathtaking speed: capture on the 27th of April, execution on the 28th, and the grim public display that followed on the 29th. In the chaos of northern Italy, partisan commanders made decisions born of immediate military necessity and political instinct, not the distant luxury of legal precedent. For the Italian resistance, this was more than an execution. It was a culmination. The shadow networks that had fought for months in occupied territory had finally proven that even the most entrenched power could be broken by determined popular will. This psychological victory rippled far beyond Italy's borders, inspiring other resistance movements still locked in their own struggles against fascism. The international reaction among the Allied nations was a mixture of grim satisfaction and strategic relief. Winston Churchill acknowledged the fall of a primary enemy, while American officials viewed it as yet another sign that the war in Europe was reaching its conclusion. Soviet leaders, meanwhile, praised the partisan action as a powerful example of successful popular resistance. Within Italy itself, Mussolini's death marked the beginning of a profound and painful reckoning. The nation faced the staggering task of rebuilding not just its cities, devastated by years of warfare, but its very soul. Decades of authoritarian rule had corrupted its political and social institutions, leaving behind a legacy of ruin that would influence Italian society for generations. Nowhere was that legacy more visible than in the haunting image left behind in Milan. The spectacle of Mussolini's corpse in Piazzale Loreto became a powerful and enduring symbol of dictatorship's final consequence and of the violent possibility of popular resistance. It served as both a stark warning to would-be tyrants and a dark inspiration to those who might need to oppose them. The quiet roadside in Giulino di Mezzegra, where the final shots were fired, became a different kind of pilgrimage site. Visitors came not to celebrate a fallen leader, but to reflect on the lessons of his rise and fall, and to remember the ordinary Italians who had found the courage to resist. Those final 24 hours encapsulate one of the most dramatic collapses in political history. The man who had promised to restore the glory of Rome, who had led his country into disastrous alignment with Nazi Germany, met an end stripped of all grandeur. His final hours were not defined by the rhetorical flourishes of his career, but by fear, desperation, and ultimate helplessness, a dictator consumed by the very forces of history he could no longer control.